The sky above the planet Aethelgerd was not blue. It was a shimmering, perfect gold. High above the clouds, a city made of diamond and light floated in the air. This was the home of the Aethel. They weren't just aliens, they called themselves gods. For 10,000 years, the Aethel had ruled the galaxy. They didn't use soldiers, they used god-killers. These were elite assassins with armor that could turn invisible and swords made of pure energy. They had destroyed entire star systems without even getting a scratch on their boots. To them, every other species in the universe was just a bug waiting to be stepped on. But today, the Golden City was not singing. It was screaming. Inside the great laboratory, a place where the Aethel created weapons that could move moons, there was a strange, terrifying sound. Sealange. It wasn't the high-pitched hum of a laser. It wasn't the clean zip of a plasma bolt. It was the heavy, ugly sound of metal hitting metal. The god-killers, the galaxy's most feared warriors, were doing something they had never done before. They were backing away. Their high-tech sensors were screaming warnings. Their invisible shields were flickering. They looked like terrified children. In the center of the room, surrounded by broken glass and smashed computers worth billions of credits, stood a man. His name was Elias. He was a human. He wasn't wearing a shiny space suit or a jetpack. He was wearing a pair of dirty oil-stained work pants and a gray t-shirt soaked in sweat. His face was covered in dust, and his knuckles were bleeding. He looked like a man who had just finished a long day of construction work. He looked normal. But in his hands, he held something the Aethel couldn't understand. It was a heavy, old, scratched sledgehammer. The handle was made of simple wood, worn smooth by years of use. The head was a solid block of dull iron. It didn't glow. It didn't have batteries. It didn't have a computer chip. One of the god-killers, a creature with 4 arms and a helmet that could see through walls, stepped forward. His energy blade hissed. He pointed it at Elias and shouted in a voice that sounded like thunder. "Stop, tiny creature, you are in the house of gods. Drop your primitive stick or be erased from history." Elias didn't say a word. He didn't give a grand speech about freedom or justice. He just looked at the golden warrior, spat a bit of blood on the floor, and gripped the wooden handle tighter. The god-killer lunged forward, moving faster than a human eye could follow. He swung his energy blade, expecting to slice Elias in half. But Elias didn't try to outrun him. He didn't try to be fast. He was a demolition man. He knew how weight worked. Elias stepped to the side, just an inch, and swung the hammer in a wide, heavy circle. The hammer didn't care about the energy blade. It didn't care about the god-killer's divine armor. The iron head hit the assassin's chest with the full weight of human anger. C-R-A-K, the unbreakable. Armor shattered like a cheap dinner plate. The god-killer was sent flying across the room, smashing into a wall of glowing crystals. He didn't get up. The rest of the elite team froze. Their computers were blinking. Error. Their technology told them that a wooden stick and a piece of iron shouldn't be able to break god armor. But there it was. The god-killer was broken, and the human was still standing. The narrator's voice drops to a whisper. How can a species that lives for 10,000 years be afraid of a piece of iron on a wooden stick? The Aethel forgot one simple rule of the universe. It doesn't matter how smart you are, or how fancy your lights are. Everything breaks if you hit it hard enough. Elias lifted the hammer again, resting it on his shoulder. He looked at the remaining gods, and finally spoke. "My turn," he said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the galaxy. To understand why a man is standing in a golden palace with a sledgehammer, you have to look back 6 months. You have to look at a small, dusty rock on the edge of the galaxy called Colony 412. Elias wasn't a soldier. He was a third-generation miner. His hands were thick with calluses, and his lungs were used to breathing filtered air. He lived a simple life. He worked the mines during the day and came home to a small metal shack where his daughter played with robotic toys made of scrap. In the corner of that shack sat the sledgehammer. It wasn't a weapon back then. It was a family treasure. His grandfather had used it to build the first foundations of the colony. To Elias, that hammer represented honest work. Then the gods arrived. The Aethel didn't land their ships to talk. They didn't send diplomats. They just appeared in the sky like bright, burning stars. They wanted the soul crystals, a rare mineral buried deep under the colony's floor. These crystals powered the Aethel's immortality machines. To them, the humans living on top of the crystals were no different than ants living in a flower bed. The High Commander of the Aethel, a being who wore a cape made of woven starlight, looked down at the colony from his floating throne. He saw the humans running in fear. He saw their small, rusty tractors and their simple hand tools, monkeys with shovels. The commander had laughed. burn the nests, take the stones. In one afternoon, Elias's world turned to ash. The Aethel used orbital beams to erase the colony. They didn't do it out of hate. They did it because they didn't think humans were important enough to save. Elias watched his home vanish. He watched the Aethel soldiers, the god killers, walk through the fire, picking up the crystals while stepping over the broken lives of his friends. They took everything. But as the Aethel ships lifted off, Elias crawled through the smoking ruins of his home. His fingers dug into the hot dirt until they hit something hard and wooden. He pulled out the sledgehammer. The handle was scorched, but the iron head was cold and heavy. Elias looked at the sky. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just gripped the hammer so hard his knuckles turned white. He realized something the Aethel missed: the gods were arrogant. You see, the Aethel spent millions of years perfecting their phase shields. These shields were a masterpiece of science. They worked by vibrating at 1,000,000 times per second. If a high-speed bullet hit the shield would phase the bullet into heat and dust. If a laser hit it, the energy was reflected away. The faster and more advanced a weapon was, the better the shield worked. But the Aethel had forgotten about the slow death. Their shields were programmed to detect high-velocity threats, things that moved fast, like missiles or light beams. Their computers didn't even see things that moved at the speed of a human arm. To the shield's computer, a swinging hammer was just a soft object, or a slow movement, like a person sitting down in a chair. Because the Aethel thought humans were primitive, they didn't bother to update their security. They didn't lock their back doors, the maintenance tunnels and cargo bays of their golden city, because they assumed no monkey could ever get past their high-tech sensors. They didn't expect a man who knew how to hide in the shadows of a cargo ship. They didn't expect a man who had spent 20 years breaking rocks for a living. Elias had spent months tracking them. He had sold his soul to smugglers just to get a ride to the Golden City. He didn't bring a bomb. He didn't bring a gun. He brought the one thing the Aethel's computers literally couldn't understand. Back in the laboratory, the god killers stared at Elias. They checked their wrist computers, confused. Their screens said threat level 0. Their sensor said material wood and iron, danger none. But then they looked at their comrade, laying broken on the floor. Elias took a step forward. His heavy work boots went thud, thud, thud on the polished diamond floor. He looked at the High Commander, who was watching through a glass balcony above. "You called us monkeys," Elias said, his voice low and raspy. "Well, you're right about one thing. Monkeys are really good at smashing things." He raised the hammer. The gods had made a mistake. They had built a world of glass and light, and they had invited a man whose only job was demolition. The Golden Palace was a maze of light, but Elias didn't need a map. He followed the sound of his own breathing and the heavy clink of the hammer's head against his leather belt. To the Aethel, he was a ghost. Their high-tech cameras were looking for heat signatures of plasma guns or the electronic hum of hacking devices. They weren't looking for a man who smelled like dirt and old grease. When the elite guards finally found him in the Great Hall, they didn't raise their alarms. They laughed. These guards were 7 feet tall, covered in armor that looked like liquid silver. They held rifles that could melt a mountain. To them, Elias looked like a joke. One guard stepped forward, his voice echoing through his helmet. "You traveled across the stars to bring a stick to a god fight. How pathetic." The guard pulled the trigger. A ball of white, hot plasma screamed through the air. But Elias wasn't standing still. He didn't have a shield, but he had something better: experience. In the mines, if a rock falls, you don't stand there, you move. Elias swung his sledgehammer not at the guard, but at a massive decorative stone pillar nearby. Karakan, the pillar made of rare moon marble, shattered instantly. As the plasma bolt hit the dust cloud, Elias kicked a heavy metal crate, the kind used to haul crystals, directly into the path of the next shot. The gods were used to enemies who fought with light and energy. They weren't ready for a man who used the very room as a weapon. Elias moved through the smoke like a shadow. He wasn't running, he was closing the distance. The guards grew frustrated. "Activate the ultimate Aegis," the leader commanded. Suddenly, a hum filled the air. A blue, glowing dome appeared around each guard. This was the ultimate shield. It was designed to stop a nuclear blast. It moved with the guards, vibrating so fast it was invisible to the naked eye. The guards stopped moving. They stood there, smiling behind their visors. They thought they were invincible. They wanted Elias to try and hit them so they could watch his primitive stick vaporize into dust. Elias walked right up to the lead guard. He looked at the blue glow, just inches from his face. He could feel the static electricity making his hair stand up. The narrator's voice turned serious. This is the human factor. The Aethel built their world on logic. They thought a shield that stops a bullet must be able to stop anything. But they forgot the simplest law of physics. Force equals mass times acceleration. Elias didn't swing fast. He didn't try to be a ninja. He planted his feet, twisted his hips, and let the 10 pounds of solid iron do the work. The sledgehammer moved at a low velocity. To the shield's computer, the hammer looked like a gentle breeze or a person leaning against a wall. The computer didn't see a threat, so it didn't push back with full power. Whoom. The sound wasn't a spark, it was a crunch. The iron head passed right through the blue light and slammed into the shield generator sitting on the guard's chest. The Aethel's perfect. Technology didn't just break, it folded. The delicate crystals inside the generator turned into powder. The blue light flickered once and died. The guard's eyes went wide with shock as the air was knocked out of his lungs, sending him skidding across the floor like a broken toy. The other guards froze. Their screens were flashing, system failure. They couldn't understand it. How could a piece of metal from the Stone Age defeat a shield that cost 1,000,000 credits? Elias didn't give them time to think. He moved to the next one. Your machines are too smart for your own good. Elias muttered, his voice echoing in the silent hall. They're looking for a war. They aren't looking for a guy who just wants to break things. With every swing another god fell, shatter crunch, snap. The golden floor was soon covered in the scrap metal of invincible armor. The god killers, the warriors who had conquered 1,000 worlds, were backing away in total horror. They realized that their shields weren't protecting them. They were just making them slow targets for a man with a hammer. Elias stood in the center of the wreckage, his chest heaving. He looked up at the high throne. The gods weren't laughing anymore. They were finally starting to understand in a world of glass, the man with the hammer is king. The high throne room was a masterpiece of ego. The walls were made of living glass that showed the history of the Aethel's conquests, and the ceiling was a swirling map of the stars they owned. At the center sat the Aethel king, a being whose body was made of pure, white light. He didn't move. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just stared at Elias with eyes that looked like burning suns. Enough. The king's voice boomed, vibrating through the very air. You are a creature of meat and bone. You live for 70 years and then you rot. I have lived since your ancestors were living in caves. I am the mind and you are the dirt. The king raised a hand. This was his ultimate weapon, the neural link. The Aethel used it to control entire populations. It was a wave of psychic energy that could make a man forget his own name, turn an army against itself, or make a hero fall to his knees in tears. A ripple of purple energy washed over Elias. The air turned cold. In Elias's mind, 1,000 voices began to scream. They told him he was weak. They showed him images of his destroyed home, his lost friends, and the giant empty void of space. The god was trying to drown his soul in despair. But the Aethel king made a fatal mistake. He tried to control a mind that was already occupied. Elias wasn't thinking about the past. He wasn't thinking about the future. He was a miner. When you are deep underground, and the oxygen is low and the rocks are shifting above your head, you don't think about destiny. You think about the rhythm. Left foot forward. Grip the wood. Breathe out. Swing. To the king's horror, the human didn't stop. Elias's eyes stayed clear. The psychic energy slid off him like rain off a tin roof because Elias had simplified his entire existence into a single physical motion. He wasn't a mind to be controlled. He was a machine of gravity and iron. Liv smashed a decorative statue of a goddess. Shirake, the shockwave from the hammer, hit the floor, sending a spiderweb of fractures toward the king's throne. The elite god killers saw their king's power failing, and panic, a cold, oily feeling they hadn't felt in eons, began to spread. They tried to fire their disintegration rays, but their hands were shaking. They were used to fighting people who feared them. They didn't know how to fight a man who looked at them like they were just a stubborn wall that needed to be knocked down. Kill him! The king screamed, his voice losing its divine calm. The guards rushed in, but Elias was in his zone. He didn't use fancy footwork. He used the demolition sweep. He swung the hammer low, catching a guard in the shins. The armor, designed to deflect high heat lasers, simply buckled. The bones underneath snapped like dry twigs. Another guard tried to grab the hammer's handle. Elias stepped in close and slammed his forehead into the alien's visor. Then, with a grunt of effort, he brought the hammer down on the guard's shoulder. The god killer collapsed. His shoulder turned into a mess of blue blood and shattered ceramic. The narrator's voice is grim. The Aethel spent millions of years preparing for a war of the future. They built armor for radiation, for heat, for electricity. But they never built armor for a 10-pound block of iron hitting them at 60 miles per hour. Their science was a lie, and the human was the truth. One by one, the immortals began to do something they hadn't done in a million years. They ran. The gods were screaming. They tripped over their own silk capes. They pushed each other out of the way to reach the exit pods. The Great Hall, once a place of worship, was now a slaughterhouse of technology. Elias didn't chase them. He didn't have to. He walked toward the high throne. Each step was heavy. Each step sounded like the ticking of a clock. The king stood up, his white light flickering like a dying light bulb. For the first time, he saw Elias not as a monkey, but as a predator. He saw the scratches on the hammer, scratches from years of breaking real rocks, and realized that his godhood was nothing compared to the reality of a human with a tool. Elias reached the base of the throne. He looked at the king, then at the hammer. "Nice house," Elias said, his voice cold. "Shame it's got to come down." The king's eyes went wide. The gods didn't survive the fear, and now the throne wasn't going to survive the hammer. The High King of the Aethel didn't die from a laser or a bomb. He died because his immortal throne was built on a foundation of glass and pride. When Elias swung that hammer one last time, hitting the central power core beneath the king's feet, the golden rhythm of the city stopped. The hum of the anti-gravity engines died. The lights flickered and turned a cold, dead gray. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Golden City began to feel something it had forgotten: gravity. Outside, the citizens of the galaxy, the oppressed, the workers, and the lesser species looked up at the sky. They saw the floating paradise of the gods begin to tilt. They saw smoke pouring from the diamond towers. And then they saw it fall. It didn't explode like a ship. It crumbled like an old building being demolished by a master. Down on the surface of the planet, in the middle of a massive dust cloud, there was a heavy silence. The Aethel survivors crawled out of the wreckage, their beautiful clothes torn, their magic. Technology now just piles of useless junk. They looked around, waiting for an army to surround them. They expected tanks, ships, and thousands of soldiers. Instead, they saw one man. Elias walked out of the thick black smoke. His boots were torn, his skin was covered in soot, and his arm was bruised. But his grip on the wooden handle of the sledgehammer was as steady as a rock. He didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like a man who had just finished a very long, very hard shift at the mine. He didn't say a word to the fallen gods. He didn't need to. He simply walked past them, the metal head of his hammer dragging slightly on the ground, making a sound that sent shivers down their spines. The narrator's voice becomes deep and thoughtful. The galaxy was changed that day, not by a new invention, but by a very old one. The Aethel had studied human history. They knew about our wars and our bombs, but they ignored our tools. They forgot that before we were soldiers, we were builders. And before we were builders, we were breakers. A few days later, the footage from the palace cameras was leaked to every screen in the universe. Billions of aliens watched a single human smash the god killers with a piece of iron. They watched the ultimate shields fail against the simple physics of a heavy swing. The shock was felt in every corner of the stars. Empires that had planned to invade Earth quietly canceled their plans. Dictators who called themselves divine suddenly felt very mortal. They all looked at their high-tech walls and wondered, is this strong enough to stop a hammer? The final scene of the video takes place in a small, quiet room back on Earth. Elias is sitting at a wooden table. On the table is a digital map of the galaxy, glowing with 1,000 points of light. Some of those lights represent the remnants of the Aethel Empire. Others represent new threats rising in the dark. Elias doesn't look at the map with anger. He looks at it the way a carpenter looks at a piece of wood with a knot in it. He picks up his sledgehammer. The iron is chipped. The wood is stained with his own sweat. He slowly places the hammer down, right in the center of the galactic map. The weight of the iron makes the table creak. The lesson was finally clear to everyone: humanity is not a species of gods. We are a species of workers. We don't want your gold. We don't want your worship. But if you come to our homes, if you take our families, and if you claim to be untouchable, we will find the weak spot in your walls. Because if you spend your entire history learning how to break rocks, eventually you get really, really good at breaking gods. The screen fades to black. The only thing left is the sound of a single, heavy heartbeat and the distant clang of iron hitting stone.